I remember a long time ago I heard a cartoonist, it might have been R. Crumb, I'm not sure who it was, who said that drawing comics takes so much time and effort that a lot of cartoonists are strange people because they have to spend so much time basically by themselves drawing and drawing and drawing to tell their stories. It's not a collaborative medium. It's solitary activity. And as a result, a lot of cartoonists are kind of weird. And they're taking the thoughts that occupy their brains, that they spend a lot of time going over and over again as they're doodling and cross-hatching. And that's why comics can often have a strange perspective. I think a lot of the people who read comics share that perspective. It's often the domain of lonely teenagers, and that's certainly how it began for me. But I think it can be true of, I think, of a lot of art forms, that if you spend a lot of time working on your art, whether it's writing or recording music or painting, in an activity that involves, spending time with your craft, you can develop a perspective that may be detached from the common reality of many people. Today I want to talk about Chris Ware, who I think he would readily acknowledge this. In fact, he may have even been the source of this quote, this idea of the uniqueness of people who focus in this way, the loner theory. And Chris Ware is known basically for one comic that he did over the years called Jimmy Corrigan. He's done some other things, but I would say Jimmy Corrigan is kind of his masterwork. And it began as a series of these little magazines. Each one was different, and they were self-published. Just looking at the cover of this, you can see typical Chris Ware, all this embellishment, this detail, this strange, mysterious iconography, like what is this all about? And when you look inside, look at this. This is probably like 4-point type, and it's a description of this miniature panoramic peep show that you can cut out. So you can cut out these pieces of the cover, inside and back, and you can fold them and you can make some panoramic thing with these different layers. Of course, nobody ever will, nobody ever would, but it's certainly reminiscent of those books and magazines I can remember from a kid, where you have these kind of activities, and he's bringing us back. Nostalgia is often a thing with Ware. He grew up in farm country in Nebraska, and he lived with his mother and his grandfather. His grandfather worked for a local newspaper, and so he grew up kind of in the newspaper office. And a lot of his stories are about probably the turn of the 20th century, and again, living in this sort of farmland, the fantasy life of a little boy, Jimmy Corrigan, and growing up with his grandmother, and there's just like a lot of mystery. But you can see how beautifully designed and drawn these are, and they look like they were drawn with a computer. They absolutely were not. He drew everything here by hand, and that is the style of Chris Ware. But you see how it harkens back to so many old printing techniques and design techniques, and the stories themselves are melancholy, and he talks about things like disappointment and aging and death, and how people can kind of be casually cruel to each other, particularly to children, and can change their lives with thoughtlessness. His magazines, and here's a larger collection in this book. This book is sort of a compendium of a bunch of these Jimmy Corrigan comics. And again, it's kind of detailed stuff. If you look at the cover, let me just show you the cover for a second, because the cover folds out into this whole kind of map of the story, sort of, but but very complex and sort of like it really takes effort to kind of follow it through. And I often think in looking at his stuff that you're not really meant to follow it all through. But I think what he does, and I've heard him say this. He says, that comics are not designed to be like movies. Movies are passive information, passive entertainment where you just sit and watch. But comics are much more active. You're basically given the information in the story, but you have to assemble it and put it together yourself. So, and that's what his comics are about too. They're cinematic in a way, but they're also, and so beautifully visual. I mean, his drawings are just amazing. But also, the ways that the story is structured forces you to figure things out, to figure out how to tell yourself the story. And it jumps back and forth through time. And again, it's this ongoing story of this boy, but now he's a man, but then there's his stepfather and his father and his grandfather, and it goes back and forth, and then it goes back to his grandfather's childhood. It's an effort to read these. It's very rewarding, though, because you feel like you're reading a work of great literature. It's like reading Tolstoy or reading Dickens. It has weirdnesses. It has these. Here's another example of like houses you can cut out and assemble. So, but again, all so perfectly done. The lettering, everything like that. So what's interesting is, okay, that's Chris Ware in published form. And again, he published this magazine over the course of years, issue by issue, all by himself. But what are his sketchbooks like? And that's when it becomes really juicy. So he brought out two volumes of his sketchbook, the Acme Novelty Date Book. And again, this cover, typical, and here's like his character showing you the scale, the time frame, 1986 to 1995. And then there's some typical Warean moments in here, and then these little drawings. And then the drawings begin, and the drawings are amazing and different and disturbing in some ways. If you saw my episode about R. Crumb, you'll recognize some of the connections there. This little character that represents him is like a little Twinkie driving around. But this book is really his personal book. And it has so much hostility in it towards himself. Like here it says, "You're a fucking slouch. Don't think about it so much." It's constantly full of like these characters basically yelling at him and telling him that he's terrible. And it's sort of upsetting to look at it because you think, here's this guy, there he is. He can draw anything, he draws beautifully. He spends an awful lot of time by himself and a lot of time practicing in his drawing and then writing these kinds of things like don't get bitter, don't stagnate, respect your obsessions, value your worthlessness, read a variety of things, don't just draw comics. Your sketchbook is your friend. But he's struggling with himself. He's struggling, wrestling, and there's a looseness and a sloppiness and handcraftedness to this stuff that is not found in his comics. It's much rougher and rough on him. But this is a true artist's sketchbook in the sense that, I heard a quote from him, and he said, I'm a horrible procrastinator, and I doubt my ideas and my abilities so much that I can't sit down to work unless I have something hanging over my head. So that's why he likes deadlines. This is a guy who can draw like that, and then he writes here, "I can't stand this loneliness." It's sad. It's sad and beautiful at the same time. I ain't getting no girly action. This is a long time ago. He's married and has kids now, so his life has changed a bit since the days of this, and he's become a bit more of a well-rounded person, or so he's told me that he feels like he's, this isn't quite how he is, but yet it's still in him, this thing. But look at the quality of these watercolors. Kind of working out ideas here that became those meticulous things. And this is sort of his drawing of himself. Stop imitating yourself. Made face too long. Immediately writes, like, immediately has to critique himself. His inner critic is robust and activated. Look at all the ways that he uses. Just look at this. Like, this is his record of notes for his stories. Then little drawings that will become something else. Studies. Here's a study of a hand. Amazing drawing. We'd all give our right arms to give. And he writes bad. Bad attempt to draw foot. And it's just... It's hard to know what to do with it in a way, because on the one hand, there's so much to learn from each of these pages in terms of technique and approach and creativity, and yet you also find yourself inside of his head, and that can be a struggle. I met Chris Ware in the process of making this book, An Illustrated Life. There's a section here of his, and I want to read you some of it, but I'll read it to you while I take you through Volume 2 of the Acme Novelty Date Book. I made tepid attempts at keeping a sketchbook in high school, but nothing ever took, as I was too distracted by the popular culture that surrounded me at the time to stay with anything for more than a few pages. My freshman year in college, I started keeping one simply because I realized that if I didn't start soon, I probably never would. Plus, I was so miserable and lonely at that time, I wanted something in which I could record how fascinating I thought I was. Needless to say, I was fairly disoriented at this point, trying to grow up quickly into the idea of fine art that I was encountering in school, and feeling extremely inadequate in the face of them. This is in the mid-'80s, when so-called postmodern painting was in full bloom, with lots of juxtaposition and overthinking, really confusing me about my own aims and the general viability of doing something directly emotional on the printed page. However, it was about 2 years later that I first encountered the 2001 facsimiles of Robert Crumb's sketchbooks. It was seeing these books that saved my life, I think. I'd already been familiar with Robert Crumb's comics, but had not been aware of the regimen he put himself through to improve his drawing ability, to say nothing of simply trying to see the world as intensely as possible, which is what I'd really wanted to do when I'd originally got to art school, but had lost sight of. I'm not sure that without seeing his sketchbooks, I'd have had the will or clarity of thought to get myself back on track. I immediately concentrated more on trying to draw directly from life, which I was already doing in a more dutiful way in my life drawing classes. The best classes I ever took in school, by the way, apart from literature classes. As a result, I suddenly found my sketchbook to be a refuge and no longer something to remind me of how irredeemable and unintelligent I was. In other words, Robert Crumb put me back in touch with myself, which is something I hadn't even realized I'd lost from my childhood until his sketchbook showed me I had. I really think he's one of the most important artists alive for this reason, because his work provides the same honest rudder to a reader, even if he or she isn't an artist. I've kept this derivative, Crumb-esque form of sketchbook ever since, mostly using it as a means of trying to see the world better, drawing uncensored and indulgent comic strips, planning sculptures and paintings, recording meandering diary entries, and the usual self-dares. Incidentally, drawing is rarely, if ever, pleasurable to me. It would be sort of disgusting if it was, or at least extremely embarrassing and indulgent to print the results. I spend a lot of time worrying about whether the pages are interesting or not, and whether certain colors work, whether a new drawing has ruined an otherwise not too terrible page, all of which are paralyzing and stupid thoughts, but I'm an extremely uptight person. I actually tried to use the sketchbook to not be so uptight, but it obviously doesn't work so well. I do occasionally try to come up with different approaches to storytelling, but I usually feel ridiculous doing such things, as it reminds me too much of art school, and then I start talking to myself while I'm drawing. It was probably in the long run a mistake to publish my sketchbooks. One of the worst things that can happen to an artist is becoming aware of oneself as a personality, which is I've nonetheless tried to make fun of for the books themselves. It's also another reason I started keeping a private comic strip diary. When I look back through the books I've filled, I feel appalled, and especially that the drawings which I thought were the slightly better ones are actually much worse than I recall. It's unattractive to beat yourself up, right? Particularly when you're as gifted as Chris Ware is. But that's his demon. That's what he wrestles with, and he uses the sketchbook to bring it out. And, it's his truth. So we have to respect that. I love his work. I really love these sketchbooks. I think, as I said, there's an awful lot to learn from looking through them. Despite the fact that you sometimes have to say, you want to call him up and say, what is wrong with you? But I think he probably knows that and asks himself the same question too. Anyway, Chris Ware, interesting connection with Robert Crumb. In some ways similar mindsets, similar approaches, similar commitment to drawing. I think it's also interesting what they both say about how if you become famous for publishing your sketchbooks, it can have an effect on your self-consciousness when you draw. On a meager scale, I sort of understand that, but I guess it's a nice problem to have. Hey, thanks for joining me again for Sketchbooks Club, and we'll see what we do next. I have always coming up with fresh inspiration for myself, and I'd like to share it with you. Again, I recommend the Acme Novelty Date books if you can find them. They're a little bit old, but they're still available, and a lot of his work is available in print still, and highly worth looking at, particularly the Jimmy Corrigan stuff. Really like reading a fantastic literary novel. Bye-bye.